Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Protection Paladin in Dragonflight patch 10.2. This is primarily going to focus on how to play the class, since it's a guide. If you want more of a deep dive on the philosophy of the class, you should check out the State of the Class video I made a few weeks ago. And with that being said, let's just get right to it. We'll start with the changes. The only real change that Paladin has had has been sort of a bug fix to some small issues between the overlap of being inside of Consecration and maintaining the Mastery buff, which grants a lot of damage reduction from being inside that Consecration. Basically, it wasn't updating correctly. You could have the buff while outside the circle or re-enter an old circle and not immediately get the buff. It wasn't great. I think it may have been exacerbated by the talent Consecrated Ground, which makes your Consecration like 15% larger. I don't know for sure. I wasn't leading the charge on testing this bug out. It's been fixed anyway, and I mean, frankly, it's pretty minor. It's also the only change that Pallies have gotten, or Prot Pallies, I should say. Holy seems like it's gotten some nerfs. Ret Pally is still Ret Pally, so I think that makes Protection a bit stronger of a choice in raids just by osmosis. It was already really good, but that's basically it. If you liked Pally in the past, you can keep it. If you didn't like it, well, check back in the next expansion, I guess. It's good though. It's good at everything. I can tell you that at least. Now let's talk about how it plays. Prot Pallies are a tank with really powerful offensive and defensive cooldowns, and they have lots of cooldown reduction, so they have really high uptime on those cooldowns. This is word for word what I had written in the previous version of this video, and I didn't change it because it's still true. Honestly, because of gear scaling and increasing haste values, I think it's even more true now than it was in the last patch. Maybe I should say it again, but louder. Basically, Prot Pally has copied Prot Warrior's entire flow, and they honestly do it better than Warriors do now. Beyond that, Pally does what it has always done. It silences the hell out of caster mobs like crazy in Mythic Plus. It has super strong cooldowns, and it has a lot of layers of damage reduction. It can also use most of its toolkit from like a 30-yard range, which gives it a unique degree of control over situations that turn a lot of other tanks like Blood DK into just like useless bags of meat that need to be bombed with heals. The biggest downside to Paladin is that its healing is pretty limited. It has emergency healing in a pinch, but in terms of being able to just slam tons of heals into yourself over and over again, you can't do that. Now, I've said this in a few other places, but Paladin feels a bit like playing 100% of the tank while also playing like half of a healer at the same time. And most of that comes from all of your amazing cooldowns. You have Blessing of Sacrifice, Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Spell Warding, Lay on Hands. All of these skills give you a ton of control over your group's survival. This is true in both Raid and Mythic Plus, but especially in Mythic Plus, a good Prot Pally can absolutely carry a group that otherwise wouldn't be able to succeed. That's just a power that most other tanks don't have. Even Vengeance Demon Hunter, which I think is a stronger tank overall in Mythic Plus, but also just in like solo Mythic Plus, they still aren't quite able to carry the health of a group. I mean, they don't have heals that they can throw onto a party member, and Pallies do. In terms of the base rotation, it's pretty simple. It's fun enough, but it's not all that complex. This is probably a good thing because it allows you so much more freedom to focus on taking care of the other aspects of the group's survival, actually healing people from time to time, but more just like focusing on CCing and silencing mobs. The one main downside of Pally's rotation is the constant need to stand in Consecration for a major defensive bonus. We're talking over 20% damage reduction. That is the Paladin community's biggest pet peeve, and unfortunately, Blizzard has decided to double down on it with the current tier set bonuses. Yikes. Honestly, it's a pretty good tier set and a really, really great underlying class, but it is a bit like being forced to, I don't know, like do a school project with your bully so that you'll learn to get along or something. Like, come on, man. And on that note, let's talk about these annoying tier set bonuses, because numerically they're pretty good. I'll start by just reading them. Here's the 2-piece. Judgment grants a stack of Sanctification, reducing your damage taken by 2% per stack. Upon reaching 5 stacks, your next cast of Consecration is empowered, increasing its damage and healing by 200% and its radius by 30%. Sanctification's stacks are reset when your empowered Consecration ends. Here's the 4-piece. While you are within an empowered Consecration, your abilities have a chance to deal 40% bonus damage or healing as fire. Okay, here are the numbers on these bonuses. Hitting 5 stacks as a Judgment Tup buff takes about 15 to 20 seconds depending on your Grand Crusader procs. Conservatively, we'll say 17 seconds, that's a number that works out nicely for us. Consecration lasts 14 seconds with the normal talent setup, but maybe you clip it at the end or you have to move or whatever. I think 13 seconds is a nice conservative number for how long it'll last on average. That makes a nice clean 30-second cycle. So 17 seconds of build-up, 13 seconds of having the empowered consecration buff for about 40 to 45% uptime on that consecration buff. Again, if you're forced to move a lot, maybe that uptime is more in the 30 to 40% range, but we'll be optimistic here and say 40 to 45. Consecration is about 5% of your total single target damage and about 10% of your total AoE damage. This bonus would boost your consecration damage by about 80% in total, so that's about 4% more single target damage or 8% more AoE damage. Not bad for a 2-piece. Now as for the 4-piece bonus, it's just a 50% proc chance while you're in that empowered consecrate. A 50% proc that deals 40% more damage is roughly the same as just doing 20% more damage. A 40% uptime on 20% more damage is roughly 8% more damage. The 4-piece doesn't care whether you're in single target or AoE, so all totaled up, this bonus, both of the tier sets combined, is about 12 to 18% more damage, which is actually pretty legit. It's pretty good. There's also the damage reduction, which stacks up to 10%, and during the empowered consecration, stays at the 10% the whole time. This means on average you're getting at least 6% damage reduction from the tier set, which is also pretty good. And now let's talk about the downside. It's really only one obvious issue, but it's a big one: movement. Moving and using this tier set effectively go together like Mountain Dew and milk. The non-obvious issue is that if you recast Consecration during the empowered consecration, it overwrites the old empowered consecration, and the buff is just gone. It resets back to 0. This is a bigger problem, I feel, and it means that you really need to be vigilant about not overwriting your empowered consecration casts during those 2-piece procs, which can be pretty irritating. All that being said, once you get the handle of not overwriting them, as long as you're not being forced to move, it's a pretty great tier set. The problem is that you are forced to move it a lot of times, and there's really nothing you can do about it, and in those situations, it sucks. Alright, now let's talk about talents, and I have 2 main talent setups I want to focus on here, and then 1/3 sort of optional setup as well. Alright, here I have my talent setups, and like I said, I have 3 talent setups I want to look at here. One is a Mythic Plus build, and then previously I had sort of categorized these as AoE and single target raid setups, but frankly, there's only 3 talents you swap total maximum between single target and AoE and raid, and they're very obvious. So I think I've flagged these more as offensive and defensive talent setups, and I think that's a lot more instructive on sort of the differences between them. So let's start with the Mythic Plus stuff. In Mythic Plus, you're going to be focusing a lot more on group utility, so we're taking things like Cleanse Toxins, getting that sort of Dispel utility, getting things like Punishment, where you get extra Blessed Hammers when you interrupt either with Rebuke or Avenger Shield, just a lot more group utility. Unbound Freedom to help with entangling or even just moving from pole to pole. You could throw Freedom on yourself and somebody else, and now you're moving 30% faster. Nothing wrong with that. Now, we do have some talents in here, Punishment and Unbound Freedom, that quite frankly, if you're not that big of a fan of them, you can drop them and take stuff like Improved Blessing of Protection or Sacrifices of the Just to give yourself a little bit more of a different type of group utility, more defensive utility. You could take Seasoned Warhorse if you wanted, or if you're one of 2 Pallies in the group, you could take Auras of Swift Vengeance and give the group Ret Aura instead of Devo Aura as sort of the default. You could also take Fist of Justice and have a lot more Blessed Hammers available to help with stunning if that's something you wanted to do. You'd be sacrificing a little bit of sort of a bit of throughput and a bit of movement utility for you and somebody else to get sort of CC utility. Or, again, you could even take Golden Path and Seal of Mercy to give some more healing utility to the group. In any case, every talent build is going to take the bottom 3 capstone talents in the left-hand tree. Zealot's Paragon is amazing. Divine Resonance is really, really good. It adds a lot of extra damage and Avenger Shield silences and just like shielding thanks to Bulwark of Order over here in the right-hand tree. And then you're also going to take Seal of Order in the bottom left-hand side. And that's just true of all the talent builds. That's just the way that the Paladin talent tree is constructed, makes it really easy to do that. It doesn't mean you have to give up Divine Purpose, which, I mean, people have looked at it, and it seems like Divine Purpose is just not as good as Divine Resonance. Maybe someday that changes. Maybe some sort of talent changes happen down the line that'll shift that, but for now, that does seem to be the case. In the right-hand tree, you really want to take like Barricade of Faith, gives you 10% more block chance basically all the time. Strength and Adversity gives you basically 10% more parry chance all the time. Those really add up to a lot. Sentinel gives you another amazing defensive cooldown. Sanctuary gives you 5% more damage reduction whenever you're in Consecration, which should pretty much be all the time. Bulwark of Order gives you tons of shielding all the time. Soaring Shield makes your Avenger Shield hit more targets to make that interact more. And then all of these talents down here at the bottom, Righteous Protector and Resolute Defender giving tons of cooldown reduction, Inmost Light giving cooldown reduction and a lot of damage value, and just a lot of increased uptime on a really good defensive cooldown. Final Stand making Divine Shield into an actual usable defensive cooldown is pretty great. And Bulwark of Righteous Fury just adds a ton of damage. So, you know, very, very efficient damage talent for a single point. This is pretty much locked in. It's not to say that you can't shift any of these talents around, but for Mythic Plus, this is like pretty standard as far as the talent setup goes. So now let's look at the defensive raid talent setup, and it's going to look pretty similar. There are a handful of shifts here, though. For one, we don't need any of that group utility like Cleanse Toxins. That's not necessary. We've taken Seasoned Warhorse. Obviously, we don't need Blind, so we've taken Auras of Swift Vengeance. We've taken Unbound Freedom to have some more movement speed for us as well. And then you can take Recompense. I took Imp Bop just to be sort of more group utility oriented, to have spell wording available more often, but that's completely dependent on fight timings. If you don't need Imp Bop, then I would definitely take Recompense. You can get some free damage out of it. Or you could take Sacrifice of the Just and throw Sacrifice on your other tank, and then that also is helpful. You'll note we're not taking any of the silence talents, interrupt talents, because generally speaking, you're not interrupting in a raid. And if you are, you got Avenger Shield, but you could also take that. It isn't really all that necessary. In the right-hand tree, we've dropped a lot of the more damage-oriented talents. Things like Bulwark of Righteous Fury isn't in here since this is a defensive talent setup. Seal of Reprisal isn't being taken. We are taking Tears Enforcer, and that's maybe not necessary if it's a pure single-target fight and you really don't care about that extra damage, which adds up to a small amount, a decent amount over the course of a fight. You could just put 1 point in Bastion of Light, and then you'll have another free point to play around with somewhere else. You could maybe put it into Consecrated Ground. This is a talent that I haven't taken and most people haven't been playing with, but with the tier set emphasizing staying in Consecration even more, maybe you could justify taking this, maybe. It certainly is like an option I think some people are thinking about. But generally speaking, the main talent shifts here are that we've switched to Focus Enmity because the idea is Soaring Shield bumps your Avenger Shield from hitting 3 targets up to 5. Now, Focused Enmity used to have the downside of making Avenger Shield only hit 1 target, which made it bad for anything but pure single target. Now it just makes it do double damage if it hits a single target. So it doesn't cap you at 1 target, you still hit 3. So for anything that's got fewer than 4 targets, you're only gaining damage by running Focused Enmity. That is the case in a lot of these raid fights. So Focused Enmity will be the go-to talent in this choice node here for most raid fights, and the only fight I can really think of off the top of the dome in a Mirdrasil that's going to have 5+ targets to hit is Gnarl Root. But Agira, Volcaros, Council, maybe Llarold could have 5+ targets at points to hit with Avenger Shield with Soaring Shield. But Naimu, however it's pronounced, that's all going to be 1 target at a time. Smolderon single target, Tendril single target. Farrak, maybe you would be able to get away with Soaring Shield. But for most of the fights, Focused Enmity is going to do just fine. And so because of that, you want to drop Strength and Adversity for Crusader's Resolve. Don't know why I struggled with that word. Crusader's Resolve. Stacking 2% damage reduction debuff on enemies up to 6%. Not a huge amount of damage reduction, but I'll take 6% damage reduction from a single talent point, especially one that you need for pathing anyway. It's pretty good. And then Final Stand, not necessary, but if you want to use it, it can be pretty great. If you feel like it's something you don't need at all, you could take Bastion of Light, or again, Consecrated Ground, or even Seal of Reprisal if you just want a little more damage. And then finally, single target, we're taking Hammer of the Righteous. The only real downside of running Hammer of the Righteous, because it does quite a lot more damage than Blessed Hammer. You know, Blessed Hammer, you can see 2,380 holy damage to enemies. Hammer of the Righteous, 14,000 physical damage. Quite a lot more damage. Fewer charges, a little weaker for your rotation. The main issue is that you can't use it when you're out of melee range. Like, you know, I'm not in melee range of anything. I'm spamming Blessed Hammer, it's not doing anything. Or Hammer of the Righteous, rather. It's not doing anything. If I swap talent setups to this offensive setup here that just happens to have Blessed Hammer in it, boom, I can build Holy Power while I'm not in melee range. And that is the one thing I really like about Blessed Hammer. You can build Holy Power beforehand. You can accidentally kill critters that are standing around you. It's great. Now here we have the offensive talent setup, and as you can see, we've dropped a lot of these defensive talents, like Gift of the Golden Valkyrie gives you kind of a defensive lifeline. Inmost Light, we're dropping that cooldown reduction on Eye of Tyr. Obviously not taking Final Stand, we're taking all the damage talents so that we can, even sacrificing like Barricade of Faith. We're definitely taking Recompense, because that's free damage. You want to use Blessing of Sacrifice on cooldown as much as you can on the other tank. This is probably the thing I forget most when I'm doing a like pure damage output in raid Paladin setup, is I forget the Blessing of Sacrifice on cooldown. You know, hey, that's free damage, free real estate, and you're just leaving it out there forgetting. So definitely important to remember that. Other than that, most of the left-hand tree stays the same. As you can see, no real Mythic Plus utility. And in the right-hand tree, if it's a pure single target fight, you're again going to want to run Hammer of the Righteous and Focused Enmity. If it's more AoE oriented, you can get away with Blessed Hammer, and you'll want to run Soaring Shield. You're probably going to want to run Crusader's Resolve in raid either way. There really aren't enough situations where I think you're going to get much value out of all that parry chance from Strength and Adversity in raid. And then most of the rest of the talents are just like Sanctuary, 5% damage reduction. Awesome talent. Doesn't give you damage, maybe won't run it in a damage-oriented setup. Obviously, you can move things around. You don't have to take Seal of Reprisal that only gives you damage. You can drop that and take Sanctuary if you feel like you need the damage reduction more than the damage output. But anyway, there it is. All right, that is it for talents. Okay, now let's move on to the rotation. The fundamentals of the Paladin rotation are to maintain Consecration, keep all of your Holy Power generators on cooldown, spend your Holy Power on Shield of the Righteous, and use Avenger Shield as it's available. Maintaining both Shield of the Righteous and Consecration is really important for staying alive. You never want to let your Holy Power overcap. It is better to use Shield of the Righteous when you already have a lot of time remaining on it than to ever let your Holy Power go over the cap. I mean, that's resources wasted. It's like setting money on fire. Don't do that. You have several talents that benefit from spending Holy Power, so you just kind of want to spend Holy Power as soon as you get it. Generate it as fast as you can. Most of the time you just want to spend it as fast as you can. You pretty much just want to treat it like that. Word of Glory is your main heal. It is a heal. You use it when you need healing. You get a free cast of Word of Glory every 3 times you use Shield of the Righteous, and that is sort of what dictates your ability to heal. It usually means that it's available for free when you need it, and you really want to try to only cast it when it's free. It's not like illegal. The cops aren't going to come to your house and arrest you if you spend Holy Power on a Word of Glory, but that is stealing upcoming damage reduction from Shield of the Righteous to give yourself a heal in the moment. Definitely something you want to do very sparingly. You have a couple of offensive cooldowns as well, and some really strong defensive cooldowns. Avenging Wrath is your main offensive cooldown. If you spec into Sentinel, that adds a huge boost of defensive value onto it, and I think this is the best course of action for most players who are tanking any sort of very challenging content. You'll also want to take talents like Sanctified Wrath and Righteous Protector so that Avenging Wrath or Sentinel lasts longer, helps you generate more Holy Power, and gives you cooldown reduction for spending that Holy Power. This combo of talents all has wonderful synergy with each other and massively increases your uptime and just increases your tankiness and damage while it's all active too. Eye of Tyr is a good defensive cooldown. It deals a decent chunk of AoE damage. It gives you a 25% damage reduction against everything it hits for 9 seconds. It's on a 1-minute base cooldown, so it's reasonably short. Inmost Light brings that cooldown down to 45 seconds and adds a ton more damage, which is great. It's very simple and very good. Divine Toll is an AoE burst damage skill that's great for picking up threat at the start of pulls or interrupting packs of casters. It's not really very complicated. You press the button and it throws out up to 5 Avenger shields at once, except that it will generate up to 5 Holy Power as well, which is really helpful at the start of pulls. It's not very useful in single target. It's 1 Avenger shield and 1 Holy Power. That's kind of bad for a 1-minute cooldown, but in AoE it's pretty awesome. Bastion of Light is very simple. It gives you 3 free Shield of the Righteous or Word of Glory casts, and this is mainly useful for just getting a bunch of Shield of the Righteous casts off at the start of a pull where things are a little bit more dangerous. So it's sort of a okay option in raid. Now let's talk about defensive cooldowns. I've already mentioned Sentinel, so we'll move on from that. We have Ardent Defender, which is your first lifeline in terms of defensive cooldowns. It's sort of a 2-minute base cooldown, and Resolute Defender grants it cooldown reduction, so it's more like 80 seconds on average in terms of real cooldown. It's a relatively minor amount of base damage reduction, only 20%, but it gives you an active cheat death effect, which is really powerful for dealing with big boss hits. Just a really good defensive cooldown. You have Guardian of Ancient Kings, which is a very straightforward shield wall. Just you use it to mitigate huge bursts of damage, or at the start of dangerous Mythic Plus pulls. The base cooldown is 5 minutes, but again, thanks to Righteous Protector, the average cooldown is more like 3.5. You have Blessing of Sacrifice, which is an external cooldown you can use on other players to steal some damage taken from them and channel it into yourself. You have Blessing of Protection, which you can use to clear some physical debuffs from yourself or protect yourself or other players from all physical damage. It will set the target's threat to 0 while it's active, so you don't want to use it on yourself while you're tanking most of the time. I'll go over that in a bit more detail in a second. You also have Blessing of Spell Warding, which makes the target immune to spell damage and prevents magic effects from being applied to the target. Unlike Bop, it usually can't be used, it basically never can be used to clear any sort of magic debuffs that are already on the target. It has to be precast to immune the initial application. It's sort of like anti-magic shell from Blood Decays. That being said, it's insanely strong in a lot of situations, and it shares a cooldown with Blessing of Protection. It also does not set threat to 0, so you can cast it on yourself and continue tanking, and that's totally fine. You also have Lay on Hands. It's pretty straightforward. It's a full heal, has a bit of a long cooldown. You can use it on yourself or other players, pretty much it. And finally, Divine Shield. With Resolute Defender, it's a 2.5-minute cooldown. It basically just is like a combination of Blessing of Protection and Spell Warding. You can use it to remove some debuffs, but not all of them. You can use it in the middle of boss casts to immune the damage and debuffs, although some abilities will penetrate immunities. And you can use it and cast Taunt to force the mob to attack you for 3 seconds, but other than that, you will not be able to hold threat. The main use for Divine Shield and Blessing of Protection, for me, is to clear debuffs, usually stacking bleed effects. To do that, it's really important to have a Cancel Aura macro, and it needs to /Cancel Aura Blessing of Protection and /Cancel Aura Divine Shield. You want both of those in the same macro, and that way you can use either of them to very quickly clear a buff and then hit it, within 1/10 of a second to remove them, and then nobody gets auto-attacked. But there is one exception here, and that's Final Stand. Final Stand makes it so that your Divine Shield continuously AoE taunts everything nearby. This is a really powerful defensive cooldown. You're effectively immune to damage and debuffs the whole time, but you're also able to hold threat. And it's only a 2.5-minute cooldown. It's insanely powerful in Mythic Plus. It's even pretty useful in some raid fights as well. Again, there are some effects that can penetrate immunity, so it's not like a 100% foolproof cooldown, but it's powerful, easy to use, and super reliable. Easily the strongest tank cooldown in the game when it works, and it's available every 2.5 minutes. Crazy stuff. Now let's talk about how to pull on a Protection Paladin. This is something I always include because I know pulling packs of mobs in dungeons is challenging for newer players. Thankfully on a Pally, it's pretty easy, so this section will be kinda quick. You open up by throwing an Avenger Shield to establish AoE threat. Then depending on your cooldowns, things can branch out a bit. Your main goals are just to get Shield of the Righteous active and get Consecration active. If you have Sentinel or Eye of Tyr available, those both help a lot with establishing early threat. The same goes for Divine Toll. That's probably the biggest cheat code for establishing AoE threat early in a pull. If you don't have any of those, Ardent Defender is at least a good extra layer of tankiness while you're establishing threat and generating holy power needed to cast Shield of the Righteous. Using some sort of cooldown at the start of a pull is usually a good idea, if not for the threat generation, then at least for the defensive value when enemies are at their most dangerous. Generally speaking, it's pretty simple. Avenger Shield really does most of the heavy lifting when it comes to holding or generating AoE threat, and Shield of the Righteous is there to pick up the rest of the slack. In terms of stats, Pallies want to enchant and gem for haste, and then mastery is your second best secondary stat due to how it increases your block chance. Block works against auto attacks, spell damage, and even spell damage over time thanks to Holy Shield, so haste and mastery is really good. Strength is still your most valuable stat, so whenever possible you want to maximize your item level, but then from there, if you're comparing items that are around the same level, haste and mastery are a little better than the rest of the competition, and that's where your enchants and gems would be. Alright, I think we're about to wrap up here. I don't have a ton more to say. Prot Pally rules. It's excellent in both Raids and Mythic Plus, and it's probably the only tank that has the distinction of being very powerful in both ends of the high-level PvE endgame. I think Demon Hunter is the better Mythic Plus tank right now. I think that's pretty universally agreed upon, but Paladin is extremely competitive, especially in solo playing in Mythic Plus. They're just really good. Blizzard has already started their slow trickle of nerfs to Vengeance Demon Hunter, so if that continues and ramps up quite a bit, Paladin may wind up overtaking them at some point. Even if they never do, Pally is still one of the strongest tanks in the game in Mythic Plus, especially solo Mythic Plus, and they are also extremely strong in high-level Mythic rating, so you really can't go wrong with Paladin. Also, it's fun. I like fun. I don't know how you quantify it, but I know that it's a good thing. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.